Hello friends, welcome aboard the Sleepy Fairy Tale Express. I'm the Red Mermaid. This train is a dream journey to fairy tale land. Have you all got your train tickets? Subscribe and hit the like button to always be able to ride. Close your eyes, prick up your ears, and listen in a comfortable position. Today's story is Cinderella. In a quiet village, there was a large mansion with a wide and beautiful garden. This mansion belonged to a wealthy man. In one of the rooms inside the house, his wife lay bedridden. The room was very quiet and peaceful. Soft sunlight streamed through the window, warmly illuminating the room. Outside the window, beautiful yellow flowers could be seen. They swayed gently in the breeze, dancing as if they were performing for the sun. Under the sunlight, the yellow flowers glowed even brighter. The scenery was like a dream, so beautiful and serene. Inside the room lay the bedridden woman. Her face had grown pale due to illness, but she still retained a noble elegance. Her eyes held a mix of deep sadness and tranquility. She knew that the final moments of her life were approaching. Therefore, she felt a deep calmness and peace from within. Sensing the nearing end, she softly called her beloved only daughter to her bedside. The daughter approached slowly, tears already welling up in her eyes. She held her mother's hand tightly and looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. The mother gently caressed her daughter's hand and looked deep into her eyes. Despite the fear and sadness in the daughter's eyes, the mother comforted her with a warm and loving gaze. The room remained quiet, but within that silence, it was filled with love and sadness. Mother and daughter held each other's hands tightly, sharing the final moments together. Outside the window, the yellow flowers continued to sway in the wind, and the sunlight felt even warmer as it embraced them. My dear, always keep your faith and live kindly. The mother's voice was weak, but filled with warmth and strong courage. Her voice flowed into the daughter's heart like a gentle river. God will always be with you. I will also watch over you from heaven. As she spoke these words, the mother held her daughter's hand even tighter. Her words carried deep love, courage, and hope for the future. The mother's eyes shone with infinite love for her daughter, and the daughter's eyes filled with more tears. The daughter felt the warmth of her mother's touch, realizing how precious it was. The yellow flowers outside swayed in the wind as if blessing their love, and the sunlight warmly embraced them both. The daughter etched her mother's warm words deeply in her heart, vowing never to forget her mother's final request. She held her mother's hand even tighter, never letting go. In the quiet of the room, They gazed into each other's eyes, determined to remember this moment forever. The farewell between mother and daughter was both sorrowful and beautiful. Outside, the yellow flowers continued to sway in the wind, as if blessing their love, and the sunlight warmly embraced them. In that moment, the mansion was filled with deep love and warmth. On a cold winter day, the girl wrapped herself in a thick scarf and visited her mother's grave. The day was so cold that her breath came out in white puffs, and her fingertips were numb from the chill. Her steps were heavy and slow, but resolute, as she made her way to the churchyard. Snow gently fell, covering the path she walked on with a white blanket. The sound of the falling snow was like the whispers of angels, calm and peaceful. The grave was located in a quiet and peaceful churchyard, a place where the girl could reminisce about her mother and pray. She carefully brushed the cold snow off the grave and wept. The white snow covering the grave looked like a white cloth laid by angels. Her tears fell onto the snow, forming small, glistening ice crystals. The girl stood by the grave, thinking of her mother's warm voice and gentle touch, and prayed for a long time. The girl continued her life calmly, not losing her faith. She deeply cherished her mother's teachings in her heart and tried to act kindly even in difficult times. She woke up early every morning to help with household chores, assist neighbors, and live honestly and sincerely. Her mother's warm words always stayed with her, giving her strength. As time passed, the cold winter ended, and early spring arrived. The warm sunlight once again brightened the world, and the snow covering the grave began to melt. It was as if the white cloth was being gently removed. The girl visited the grave, praying in the sunlight. Her mother's teachings and love still filled her heart, giving her the strength to move forward. However, the joy of spring was short-lived, as the girl's father brought about a new change. He quietly remarried another woman and one day informed the girl of this fact. When he spoke, his voice carried a sense of guilt. The girl listened quietly, nodding her head. The father's new wife, her stepmother, brought with her 2 daughters. Although they appeared beautiful and elegant, they were not kind to the girl at all. The stepmother and her 2 daughters entered the house in luxurious clothing, carrying themselves with aristocratic demeanor. However, their eyes were cold and stern. The girl felt their unwelcoming gazes and sensed something unsettling in their presence. That night, the girl shed as many tears at home as she had at her mother's grave. The first encounter with these new family members was not an easy moment for the girl. That night, she cried as much at home as she had at her mother's grave. She sat in a corner of her room, listening to the stepmother and her daughter's conversations, wondering how she would adapt and maintain her faith. Their lively and joyful chatter excluded her, filling her heart with anxiety and sorrow. The girl recalled her mother's teachings, striving not to lose her faith even in these challenging times. On the day the stepmother and her two daughters moved into the big house, it was bustling with activity. The house was busy with preparations and arrangements, welcoming the new family members. However, behind the lively facade lay hidden malice. The stepmother's daughters wore beautiful dresses and walked with graceful smiles, but their eyes reflected cold calculation. They were well dressed and pretty on the outside, but their hearts were far from warm. As soon as they saw the girl entering their room, they burst into mocking laughter. Their laughter was cold and ruthless. The girl felt deeply hurt by their cold stares and mockery. "Why is that silly goose sitting in our room?" sneered the stepmother's eldest daughter, snorting disdainfully. "If she wants even a piece of bread, she better earn it. Go and do some kitchen work." Her words stabbed the girl's heart like a sharp knife. The girl couldn't say a word, and her heart ached under their mocking laughter and cold stares. She had to endure this harsh reality, so starkly different from her mother's warm words. They roughly pulled the soft clothes off the girl's shoulders. She couldn't resist, and their rough hands tugged and tore at her clothes. Instead, they threw an old, tattered, ash-gray dress and a pair of worn wooden clogs at her. "Look at this proud princess, all dressed up," they jeered. The girl swallowed her tears as she put on the old dress and clogs. The stepsisters laughed at her shabby appearance. The eldest daughter said, "When you come into our room, wear your ragged clothes." The girl's heart ached from their mockery and laughter, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. As she was dragged to the kitchen, the girl tried not to shed a single tear. She was determined not to appear weak. Her new life began in that place. Every morning before dawn, she had to draw water and light the fire in the large pot to prepare food. She was always tired and exhausted, but she couldn't stop working. Washing the dishes, scrubbing the floors, and cleaning never ended. Her hands grew rough and sore from the cold water and constant scrubbing. Despite the endless chores, the girl held on to her mother's last words for strength. Her stepsisters took delight in adding to the dirtiness. They threw kidney beans and lentils into the ashes for her to pick out. She knelt on the ground, sorting through the beans one by one. The dirt and dust made her hands dirty, and her fingertips stung as she picked out the beans. By evening, she was so exhausted that she collapsed on the cold, hard floor by the hearth to sleep. After a day's work, her body was weary and her eyes heavy. But sleeping on the cold floor was never comfortable. The poor girl was slowly forgotten, even her name. The stepsisters and stepmother called her Cinderella, meaning the girl covered in ashes. They mocked her with this name, making her feel even more wretched. Despite these harsh times, the girl remembered her mother's last words and tried not to lose her faith. Her mother's warm voice and final request gave her great strength. The girl believed that her mother was always watching over her, and she never lost her courage even in difficult situations. She held on to the hope that all this suffering would end one day, enduring each day with resilience. Waking up early to draw water, working in the kitchen all day, and sleeping on the cold floor by the hearth every night, she kept her mother's teachings deep in her heart. Even amid the daily hardships, there was always a small flame of hope burning in her heart. One clear morning, her father packed his leather travel bag and prepared for a long journey. Under the bright morning sun, he called his two stepdaughters and asked what they would like him to bring back from his travels. The eldest stepdaughter's eyes sparkled as she said, "I want a beautiful dress, Father." The younger stepdaughter clapped her hands and requested, "Bring me jewels and beads." Their demands were filled with all things luxurious and expensive. The father nodded, listening to their wishes. Their eyes were filled with anticipation and excitement. He promised to bring back the gifts they desired upon his return. Then he looked at Cinderella. "Cinderella, what would you like me to bring you?" His voice was warm, but there was a touch of sadness in his tone. He knew the hardships Cinderella was enduring and wanted to comfort her heart. Cinderella thought for a moment, then cautiously answered, "Father, please bring me the first branch that brushes against your hat on your way home." Her request was simple but meaningful. Cinderella wished to plant a tree by her mother's grave, hoping it would signify her father's safe return. The father was deeply moved by her modest wish. On his journey back, the father passed through green thickets and plucked a hazel branch that brushed against his hat. He held the branch in his hand, his heart heavy with the thought that a single branch could not compensate for all the hardships his daughter faced. Yet, he cherished it dearly, knowing it fulfilled her wish. Upon returning home, he presented the beautiful dresses and jewels to the two stepdaughters. They screamed with joy and proudly received the gifts. "These jewels are so beautiful. This dress is truly luxurious." They delighted in their gifts, showing them off to each other. The father smiled slightly at their happiness, but his heart still harbored concern for Cinderella. However, all Cinderella received was the simple branch. The father handed it to her with a sense of regret he couldn't hide. Cinderella accepted it and expressed her gratitude. She understood the significance of the gift and appreciated it deeply. Cinderella quietly walked to her mother's grave where no one could see her. She knelt before the grave, holding the branch, and wept. Her tears soaked the branch as they fell to the ground. Those tears were a mix of love, longing, and deep sorrow. Carefully, she planted the branch beside her mother's grave, believing that as it grew, it would carry her mother's love. As time passed, the branch grew into a sturdy tree. Every day, Cinderella visited the tree, praying and pouring out her sorrow and pain to it. Each time she did, she felt a bit of solace. One day, a white bird perched on the tree, as if responding to her prayers. The bird watched her, nodding as if it understood her wishes. The tree became a source of comfort and hope for Cinderella. Beneath it, she continued to feel her mother's love. The tree was both a friend who soothed her pain and a reminder of her mother's enduring love. Cinderella made a daily habit of visiting the tree to pray and wish, striving never to forget her mother's teachings. The time she spent with the tree provided great solace, and she grew alongside it. One day, excitement and anticipation filled the entire kingdom as a major event was announced. The king declared a grand ball that would last 3 days to find a bride for his son, the prince. This news spread quickly through every village, and all the young ladies were invited. The towns buzzed with activity, and people prepared for the ball, dreaming of the chance to become the prince's bride. This news also reached Cinderella's home. The 2 stepsisters couldn't hide their excitement upon hearing it. "At last, we have the chance to dance with the prince," exclaimed the eldest daughter. "The prince is sure to choose me," the younger daughter declared confidently. They eagerly began their preparations for the ball. Comb our hair, polish our shoes, and tighten the buckles. We are going to the ball at the king's palace. The voices of the 2 stepsisters were full of excitement and anticipation. Their eyes sparkled, and their faces were filled with expectation and thrill. Cinderella followed their orders. She gently combed their hair, polished their shiny shoes, and tightened the buckles. The elder sister had long blonde hair, which Cinderella carefully combed and braided beautifully. The younger sister had brown hair, and Cinderella adorned it with sparkling hairpins. The 2 sisters looked at their reflections in the mirror, satisfied with Cinderella's work. "Now we are ready to meet the prince," said the elder sister. Cinderella then began to polish their shoes. As the shoes gleamed more brightly, her heart filled with deep sadness. Tightening the buckles, she tried to suppress her own desire to go to the ball. While the stepsisters were happy with Cinderella's help, she felt a profound loneliness amidst their joy. Despite her busy hands, Cinderella's heart was filled with sorrow. She also longed to attend the ball, dreaming of dancing with the prince. She had often dreamed of this, hoping it might come true. She couldn't hold back her tears, which quietly flowed down her cheeks. Deep inside, she couldn't hide her longing. Finally, mustering her courage, she knocked on her stepmother's door. When the door opened, she asked in a trembling voice if she could go to the ball. "Stepmother, please let me go to the ball. I wish to dance like the other girls," she pleaded, her voice filled with hope and desperation. She looked at her stepmother with wide, hopeful eyes. Her stepmother looked at her with cold eyes and spoke in a stern tone. "You? To the ball? You don't even have proper clothes. How do you expect to dance?" She continued with a sneer, "Do you think anyone would care if someone like you goes to the ball?" Her words were harsh and merciless. Cinderella felt her heart break at these words, but she didn't give up. She looked her stepmother in the eye and pleaded once more. "Please, stepmother. I wish to go to the ball. Just give me a chance," she begged, her eyes shimmering with hope and desperation. The stepmother stared at her for a long moment before finally setting a condition. "If you can sweep and clean all the floors in this house and perfectly prepare the dresses for me and your stepsisters, then you may go," she said, her words dripping with hidden scorn and disbelief. Cinderella agreed to the condition, though her heart was filled with both fear and hope. Could she really accomplish all this? Would she truly be able to go to the ball? Taking a deep breath, Cinderella steeled herself. She decided to accept her stepmother's challenge and immediately began the work. She went from room to room, sweeping and scrubbing every floor. She dusted every corner and polished the floors until they shone. Her hands soon blistered, and her knees ached from constant movement. But Cinderella did not give up. She remembered her mother's last words and held on to the hope in her heart. After cleaning all the floors, she began to prepare the dresses for her stepmother and stepsisters. She ironed each dress, making sure there were no wrinkles. She also organized their accessories and shoes, ensuring everything was perfect. Though time was running short, Cinderella worked as quickly and diligently as possible. Cinderella told her stepmother that she had finished all the tasks. Her stepmother then presented yet another condition. "All right, I'll give you one final test. If you pass this test, you may go to the ball," the stepmother said, her voice cold and merciless. Her eyes were filled with a determination to test Cinderella's resolve. Cinderella hesitated for a moment, but quickly gathered her courage. She was ready to do whatever it took. "I will complete any test you give me, stepmother. Please, let me go to the ball," she said, her voice full of desperation. The stepmother looked at her with a mocking smile, confident that Cinderella would fail. "Fine, Cinderella. If you want to go to the ball so badly, you must complete this task. If you don't, you will never go to the ball." She led Cinderella to the yard, where a large pile of ashes was heaped. The stepmother picked up a handful of lentils and tossed them into the ashes. "You must pick out all the lentils from this pile of ashes. If you don't finish before sunset, you won't be allowed to go to the ball." Cinderella listened to her stepmother's words and worried if she could complete such a daunting task. But she resolved not to give up. She took a deep breath, thinking of her mother's teachings, and strengthened her resolve. "Yes, stepmother. I will do it," she quietly replied. Stepmother went to the large courtyard and threw lentils into the thick layer of ashes. She deliberately tossed the lentils deep into the ashes, confident that Cinderella would never be able to complete the task. As the lentils disappeared into the ashes, a cynical smile spread across her face. Cinderella watched with a heavy heart, realizing the impossibility of sorting through all the lentils in the ashes. Stepmother looked at Cinderella challengingly and said, "Well, start now. If you want to go to the ball so badly, you have to complete this task." She continued to watch Cinderella with a mocking grin as she began sorting through the ashes. "You'll never be able to do it," she thought to herself. "This way, Cinderella will never get to the ball." Cinderella sighed deeply and steeled herself for the task ahead. She knelt on the ground and began picking out the lentils one by one from the ashes. Her fingertips became rough and sore from the ashes and lentils, but she didn't give up. Remembering her mother's last words, Cinderella resolved to overcome any challenge that came her way. "You must pick out all these lentils from the ashes. By sunset, you must have all the lentils sorted. If you miss even one, you won't be able to go to the ball. And until this task is complete, you are not to touch any other work." Stepmother's voice was cold and her eyes were harsh. She was certain that Cinderella would not be able to complete the task and didn't bother to hide her mocking smile. Cinderella, hearing her stepmother's command, worried about whether she could handle such a massive task, but she resolved not to give up. She sighed deeply, gathered her resolve, and knelt on the floor. Cinderella began to sort the lentils from the ashes one by one. The task was grueling and endless. Her fingertips became rough and her skin stung from the ashes and dust, but she continued to work with determination, refusing to give up. Cinderella sat in the courtyard with a heavy heart. She knelt down and began sorting the lentils from the ashes one by one. The sunlight gradually faded, and her hands became covered in ashes and dust. Her fingertips ached and her knees grew cold, but she didn't stop. As she sorted the lentils, her mother's last words and her faith echoed in her mind. Behind her, stepmother and her stepsisters watched, bursting into laughter. "Foolish Cinderella, it's obvious she won't be able to do it," the eldest sister sneered. "Yes, she won't ever get to the ball looking like that," the younger sister added. Despite their mocking laughter, Cinderella quietly continued her work. She didn't give up and kept sorting the lentils from the ashes. As time passed, her hands grew dirtier and her strength waned, but her determination only grew stronger. Ignoring the cold stares and laughter directed at her, Cinderella focused solely on her task. Deep in her heart, she recalled her mother's teachings, resolving to overcome any challenge. As the sun set and darkness began to fall, Cinderella did not stop. But Cinderella did not give up. As she sorted the lentils, she silently prayed, "Mother, please give me strength. Help me to complete this task." Cinderella opened the back door leading to the garden and quietly stepped outside. Her eyes sparkled with hope. Under the calm, starry night sky, she took a deep breath and clasped her hands together. Deep inside her, a small flicker of hope remained. She walked to the large tree at the center of the garden, a place that gave her peace and comfort. Cinderella looked up at the sky. It was clear, and the stars were shining brightly. She softly spoke, pouring her deepest wishes into her words. "Dear little doves, turtle doves, and all the birds under the sky, come and help me pick these lentils. The good ones go into the pot, the bad ones into your crop." Her gentle and earnest voice carried through the night air. Still clasping her hands, she whispered her prayer while gazing at the sky. As soon as she finished speaking, the serene atmosphere of the garden began to change. The leaves on the tree rustled softly as a light breeze stirred them. At that moment, as if by magic, 2 white doves flew down and perched before her. Their eyes sparkled, and Cinderella felt a surge of hope as she looked at them. "Please help me," she pleaded once more, her voice filled with desperation. Like magic, 2 white doves flew in through the kitchen window. Following them, turtle doves and various other birds began to gather one by one. Cinderella watched with tearful eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that her heartfelt wish was coming true. The birds perched on the ashes, responding to Cinderella's call. The doves began to peck at the ashes, and soon other birds followed, deftly picking out the good lentils and placing them in the pot. The doves were skilled at finding the lentils amidst the ashes, and the turtle doves and other birds quickly joined in. Their beaks moved swiftly and accurately, sorting the lentils with remarkable efficiency. The birds worked together harmoniously. Some birds sifted through the ashes to uncover the lentils, while others picked them up and placed them in the pot. Cinderella watched this scene unfold, deeply moved by their cooperation. The birds, as if answering her heartfelt prayer, did their utmost to help her. As she observed the birds skillfully sorting the lentils, Cinderella couldn't help but smile. A small glimmer of hope grew within her. "Maybe I really can do this," she thought to herself. The sound of the birds pecking the lentils into the pot was a great comfort to her. In less than an hour, the birds had collected all the lentils and filled the pot. The sight of the birds working tirelessly with their little beaks to sort the lentils seemed like magic. The birds picked out the good lentils and placed them in the pot, while the bad ones went into their crops. Cinderella watched in awe, her heart swelling with hope. When the task was complete, the birds flew up to Cinderella, bidding her farewell with gentle flutters of their wings. The white doves softly flapped their wings and flew out the window, followed by the turtle doves and other birds. Cinderella waved to them, expressing her gratitude. "Thank you so much, my friends," she whispered. Filled with joy, Cinderella carried the pot to her stepmother. Her face beamed with a bright smile, and she couldn't contain her excitement as she thought, "Oh, I might really be able to go to the ball." She proudly showed the pot to her stepmother, feeling a sense of accomplishment for what she had done. This small miracle gave Cinderella immense hope. She had met the seemingly impossible condition set by her stepmother and could now prepare to go to the ball. Cinderella was deeply moved by the solidarity and help shown by the birds. She recalled her mother's teachings with a sense of fulfillment for her achievement. Cinderella was overwhelmed with the hope that her stepmother could no longer stop her from going to the ball. The thought of being able to attend filled her with deep joy. She imagined the dress and shoes she would wear and felt a flutter of excitement. Cinderella dreamt of dancing with the prince at the ball, eagerly anticipating the day when her dream would come true. When Cinderella successfully completed the second challenge with the help of the birds, her stepmother stared in disbelief. Her face was etched with shock and bewilderment. Stepmother had never expected Cinderella to accomplish such a difficult task. and she was filled with anger and confusion. She was unwilling to acknowledge Cinderella's success and began plotting new ways to prevent her from attending the ball. Stepmother's heart was filled with the sole desire to stop Cinderella from going to the ball. With a mocking tone, she said, "Well, you managed to do it this time. But do you really think I'll let you go to the ball?" Her voice dripped with cold derision. She looked at Cinderella with icy eyes, unable to suppress her scornful laughter. "Do you think you can go to the ball? No way. You are still not ready for it," Stepmother declared, determined to present another challenge. She was resolute in her intent to crush Cinderella's dreams and ensure she wouldn't attend the ball. "No, Cinderella. How do you plan to dance without a dress? Everyone will laugh at you." Stepmother's words were cold and cutting. She mocked Cinderella's desire to go to the ball, wounding her deeply. Tears welled up in Cinderella's eyes, but she tried to hold them back in the face of her stepmother's harshness. Seeing Cinderella's desperate expression, Stepmother smiled cynically. She devised a more brutal condition to prevent Cinderella from going to the ball. "All right, if you are so determined to go to the ball," she said with a sneer, "then pick 2 pots full of lentils from the ashes in 1 hour. If you can do that, you can go with us." Stepmother observed Cinderella with satisfaction as she scattered the lentils into the ashes, expecting her to despair. Her heart was set on ensuring that Cinderella wouldn't attend the ball. Stepmother was pleased, confident that Cinderella would fail this time. Cinderella hesitated for a moment at Stepmother's words, but soon gathered her resolve. She vowed once more not to give up, no matter what conditions Stepmother set. Cinderella took a deep breath, recalling her mother's teachings. "Always keep faith and be kind." Her mother's voice gave her strength. Determined not to give up, Cinderella headed to the garden's back door. She took a deep breath, looking up at the calm night sky, ready to seek help from the birds again. A small spark of hope remained within her heart. She clasped her hands and looked up at the sky, whispering earnestly, "Dear little doves, turtle doves, and all the birds under the sky, come and help me pick these lentils. The good ones go into the pot, the bad ones into your crop." Cinderella prayed with all her heart, her eyes filled with hope and anticipation. Cinderella's heartfelt plea echoed through the night sky. Her voice was gentle and filled with hope. As soon as she finished speaking, the stillness of the garden was broken. As soon as she finished her call, 2 white doves flew in through the kitchen window as if they had been waiting. Following them, turtle doves and various other birds descended from the sky and perched on the ashes. The doves began pecking first, and soon other birds joined in, skillfully picking out the good lentils and placing them in the pot. The doves' nimble beaks deftly sorted the good lentils from the ashes and placed them in the pot, while the bad ones went into their crops. The turtle doves and other birds followed the doves' lead, perching on the ashes and pecking at the lentils. The birds moved with incredible speed and efficiency. In a remarkably short time, just half an hour, the birds had collected all the lentils and filled the pots. The birds worked as if they had been invited to their own ball, moving swiftly and precisely. Their small beaks tirelessly picked out the good lentils, and soon 2 pots were full. Thanks to the birds' incredible help, Cinderella overcame the difficult conditions set by her stepmother once again. After the birds flew out the window, Cinderella carried the 2 pots filled with lentils and joyfully went to her stepmother. Her face shone with confidence, and hope that she could attend the ball filled her heart. "Oh, I might really be able to go to the ball," she thought, unable to contain her excitement. When Cinderella successfully completed the second challenge and handed the pots to her stepmother, her face was full of hope and expectation. She felt a sense of pride in her accomplishment and eagerly anticipated that her stepmother would now let her go to the ball. Cinderella handed over the pots and said, "I did it, stepmother. Now, please let me go to the ball." But stepmother's heart remained unmoved. She looked at Cinderella coldly, her face expressionless and devoid of any empathy. Her eyes were filled with contempt for Cinderella's efforts. Cinderella's heart pounded with anxiety, and her hopes began to crumble. Stepmother spoke, shattering Cinderella's efforts in an instant. "So, you managed to do it again. But what good will that do?" she said mockingly, laughing at Cinderella. No matter how many lentils you pick up from the ash, you won't be able to go to the ball. You have no dress and you don't know how to dance. We would be ashamed because of you. The stepmother's words were like sharp knives stabbing into Cinderella's heart. Her cold tone and dismissive attitude shattered all of Cinderella's hopes. Cinderella tried to hold back the tears welling up in her eyes, but the harshness of her stepmother's words finally made them fall. She was overwhelmed with despair, feeling that all her efforts had been in vain. But the stepmother paid no heed to Cinderella's sorrow and despair. Instead, her resolve to prevent Cinderella from attending the ball grew even stronger. The stepmother's words were like sharp knives stabbing into Cinderella's heart. Tears streamed down her face, but her stepmother and stepsisters completely ignored her, dressing themselves in their finest clothes and heading off to the ball. They flaunted their dresses and jewelry with prideful arrogance as they walked out. The stepsisters twirled their skirts, mocking Cinderella, while the stepmother smirked, taking pleasure in Cinderella's despair. Watching them leave, Cinderella felt her heart break with pain. She swallowed her tears, suppressing her desperate desire to go to the ball. As the stepmother and stepsisters departed, Cinderella was left alone in the quiet stillness of the house. Cinderella burst into tears in the lonely, empty house. Despite having completed all the challenges, she realized that she could never change the hearts of her stepmother and stepsisters. She sank to the floor, crying endlessly, weighed down by loneliness and despair. The house was silent, with only her sobs echoing through the empty rooms. Cinderella tried to recall her mother's teachings and not lose faith, but the pain and loneliness she felt at that moment were overwhelming. The dream of dancing with the prince at the ball seemed to drift further away, and she cried alone in her despair. Her heart was filled with deep sorrow and wounds. When Cinderella was completely abandoned by her stepmother and stepsisters, left alone in the house, she quietly walked to the hazel tree by her mother's grave, seeking her last hope. That place always brought her peace and comfort. In the tranquil and sacred spot where the tree stood, Cinderella sought solace. She knelt before the grave, thinking of her mother and silently shedding tears. Under the tree, she remembered her mother's love and warmth. Cinderella whispered to the tree, "Mother, please help me. I want to go to the ball. Please give me the strength to do so." She wiped her tears and looked up at the tree, her voice filled with earnest longing and desperation. "Little tree, shake and shiver, throw gold and silver down to me," Cinderella whispered softly to the tree. Her voice carried on the breeze, spreading through the branches. The tree seemed to understand her wish, gently swaying in response. Seeing the tree's reaction, Cinderella felt a small spark of hope ignite deep within her heart. The song magically conveyed her desperate heart to the tree. Soon, a white bird flew down from the sky and dropped a dress that shimmered with gold and silver at her feet. Cinderella's eyes widened in disbelief as she gazed at the astonishing sight. Before her lay a dress intricately woven with gold and silver threads, adorned with sparkling jewels, and a pair of delicate silk shoes. The dress was embroidered with exquisite patterns, interlaced with gold and silver threads, and decorated with various gemstones. The shoes were embroidered with silk and silver, appearing to be the perfect size for Cinderella's feet. The silver of the shoes gleamed in the moonlight. Her heart was filled with joy and amazement. With trembling hands, Cinderella picked up the dress. It was so soft and finely made that she felt like she was in a dream. It was hard to believe that all of this was real, but the beautiful dress and shoes before her brought tears of gratitude to her eyes. Cinderella could hardly believe her eyes, but she quickly put on the dress. The moment she wore it, her appearance transformed completely. She looked like a princess from another world, stunningly beautiful. The gold and silver adorned dress wrapped her in elegance, and the silver shoes sparkled at her feet. Cinderella looked in the mirror, admiring her transformed reflection. She was no longer the sooty girl covered in ashes. The dress fit her perfectly, and the silver shoes glittered, enhancing the beauty of her feet. A radiant smile spread across her face, her eyes shining with hope and joy. Now, she was ready to go to the ball. Now completely transformed, Cinderella confidently headed to the ball. As she entered the ballroom, all eyes turned to her. The dazzling gold and silver dress and sparkling silver shoes made Cinderella stand out even more. Everyone in the ballroom was captivated by her beauty, unable to take their eyes off her. Even her stepsisters and stepmother didn't recognize her, assuming she was a princess from a far-off land. They couldn't have imagined that this radiant lady in the golden dress was Cinderella, who they knew as the girl who crawled in ashes. Cinderella's new appearance was so enchanting that no one suspected her true identity. While admiring her new appearance, Cinderella didn't forget that all this was thanks to the hazel tree and the magical birds that lived there. She felt deep gratitude in her heart and cherished this special night. Under the bright chandeliers, she danced to the lively music, rejoicing in the realization that she could finally be the star of the ball she had always dreamed of. Cinderella spent a magical night, deeply grateful for her wish coming true. She felt as if she were in a dream, embracing the happiness and fully enjoying the moment. As Cinderella entered the ballroom, glowing with enchantment, the prince was immediately captivated by her dazzling presence. Her beauty outshone all the lights in the ballroom, drawing everyone's attention. The music filled the air, and under the shining chandeliers, the prince quietly took Cinderella's hand. At that moment, a magical connection formed between them. The prince gently asked Cinderella for the first dance. Smiling, Cinderella took his hand, and they moved to the center of the ballroom. The music played, and they carefully took their first steps together. Cinderella, trying to calm her nervous heart, began to dance. Cinderella cautiously took the prince's hand and started to dance. The prince couldn't take his eyes off her and felt that he didn't want to dance with anyone else. His gaze was fixed only on Cinderella. Her steps were graceful and light, and the prince held her hand tightly, not wanting to let go. Whenever others approached to ask her for a dance, the prince firmly said, "This lady is my partner." He enjoyed dancing with Cinderella and became even more captivated by her charm. Cinderella also felt her heart flutter at the prince's sincere gaze and warm touch. As they looked into each other's eyes while dancing, it felt as if the whole world had stopped. With the music, their hearts grew closer, and that moment seemed like it would last forever. As the evening deepened and the ball was drawing to a close, the prince gently suggested to Cinderella, "Come with me. I'll walk you home." His voice was soft and sincere. The prince wanted to know more about this beautiful lady and learn her story. Cinderella hesitated for a moment, but seeing the prince's warm smile and genuine eyes, she felt reassured. She nodded and accepted his offer. The prince, filled with joy, took Cinderella's hand and led her out of the ballroom. Deep in her heart, Cinderella felt joy and excitement. It was like a dream to be with the prince. They walked quietly under the night sky, sharing their stories with each other. However, Cinderella was afraid her secret might be revealed. She gently pulled away from the prince's grasp and suddenly ran towards the pigeon house. Her steps were quick and light, and soon she was out of the prince's sight. The prince, surprised by Cinderella's sudden action, tried to follow her. But her swift steps outpaced him, and he lost her. Cinderella darted into the pigeon house and hid. Her heart was pounding, and she took deep breaths to calm herself. The prince, confused by Cinderella's mysterious behavior, searched for her but couldn't find her. Disappointed, the prince had no choice but to wait for her father to arrive. He was still captivated by her mysterious charm and desperately wanted to discover her identity. The prince approached Cinderella's father and explained, "A strange girl ran up into the pigeon house and disappeared." His voice was filled with confusion and curiosity. Cinderella's father paused for a moment after hearing this. Could it be Cinderella? He wondered to himself. His mind was filled with concern and doubt about his daughter. The prince's words seemed genuine, and this added to his confusion. He stood thinking for a while. He had never allowed Cinderella to go to the ball, and he couldn't afford such fancy clothes. But the prince's sincere expression and Cinderella's behavior left him with doubts. He allowed the prince to investigate the pigeon house. Late in the evening, under the darkening sky, the quiet pigeon house stood in the small village, untouched by even a breath of wind. The village servants, following Cinderella's father's orders, carried heavy axes and hoes, and trudged towards the pigeon house, ready to investigate if she was hiding there. When they opened the pigeon house door with sweaty hands, it was completely empty, with only dust floating in the still air. The servants searched every corner, but there was no sign of Cinderella. The pigeon house was old and dilapidated, making it seem unlikely she would hide there. Cinderella's father, unable to find any clues, looked disappointed, and the prince shook his head dejectedly. They left the pigeon house and returned home. Meanwhile, Cinderella's stepmother and stepsisters returned home, holding hands and laughing. They bragged about how much fun they had at the ball and how much they danced with the prince. But Cinderella had already prepared for their return. She quickly took off the splendid dress she had worn to the ball and hurriedly changed into her old, ash-gray rags. In the dim light of the oil lamp flickering in the chimney, she swiftly concealed her appearance. Her hands still trembled, but she steeled her heart. Cinderella hid in a small corner of the room, waiting for her stepmother and stepsisters to enter. She held her breath, hoping they would act as usual, without suspicion. Her heart raced, and her eyes were fixed on the door, filled with tension. Then, like a small forest animal, she swiftly darted behind the pigeon house and ran to a tree. There stood an old hazel tree, waiting as if it had been expecting her. It quietly received her dress. In an instant, a bird flew down, gently picked up the beautiful dress with its beak, and disappeared. It was like magic. Cinderella caught her breath under the hazel tree, realizing she had returned to her normal life. After confirming that the birds had safely taken her dress, she tightened her ash-gray rags once more and returned home. Cinderella quietly, but swiftly, finished her actions and returned to the kitchen wearing her ash-gray rags. The kitchen was still lit by a faint, flickering light. She sat by the ashes, her fingertips still tense, and her heart quietly pounding. She waited for the sound of her family's footsteps. Her eyes glimmered with tension, and faint sweat drops moistened her cheeks. Soon, the sound of her stepmother and stepsister's footsteps grew closer. As they entered the house, they chatted excitedly. "The ball was amazing tonight," said the eldest stepsister. "Yes, I'll never forget dancing with the prince," added the younger stepsister. Cinderella felt her heart race once more as she listened to their conversation. She quietly steadied her breath, hoping they wouldn't notice her. When they entered the kitchen, Cinderella was still sitting by the ashes, her eyes on the ground, and her hands unconsciously touching the ashes. Her stepmother and stepsisters passed by without any suspicion. They boasted about the ball's events, paying no attention to Cinderella. It was only then that Cinderella let out a sigh of relief, realizing she had safely returned to her everyday life. The next day, as dawn broke, the village once again faced a significant day. As Cinderella's parents and stepsisters dressed lavishly and headed to the castle, she quietly left the house. Her steps took her towards the old wild pear tree, which seemed to grant her a special power. Cinderella stood in front of the wild pear tree and exhaled deeply. "Little tree, shake and shed, throw gold and silver down to me," she sang softly. The tree began to sway as if it understood her words. The wind brushed against the tree, and the branches swayed gently, making a faint sound. At that moment, a shining bird flew down from the sky and laid down a dress even more splendid than the one from the day before. Cinderella was astounded by the beauty of the dress. She picked it up with trembling hands and marveled at its soft texture. Wearing the dress, she looked as though she had been helped by a fairy, becoming even more beautiful. The dress sparkled like starlight, making her stand out like the moon in the night sky. Her silver shoes made her feet shine even more. Confidently, Cinderella headed to the ball. As soon as she entered the ballroom, all eyes were on her. Her stepsisters and even her stepmother did not recognize her, thinking she was a princess from a strange land. They could never have imagined that the lady in the golden dress was the Cinderella who crawled through the ashes at home. The prince had been eagerly awaiting her arrival. As soon as she entered the ballroom, the prince saw her and quickly approached her, taking her hand. Once again, a magical connection was formed between them. The prince began to dance with her. Whenever others asked her to dance, the prince firmly said, "This lady is my partner." As evening fell, Cinderella decided to leave the ball. The dance with the prince had felt magical, and she wanted to remember that moment for a long time, but she realized she could no longer stay. She hurried out of the hall and started descending the stairs. At that moment, the prince noticed her leaving and followed her. Cinderella, sensing the prince following her, quickened her steps. She found her way through the darkness and hid her body in a dense garden behind a house. There was a large tree in the garden with lush pears hanging from it. Cinderella climbed the tree as quickly as a squirrel in the forest. Her agile movements were like those of a forest animal, leaving the prince only able to watch her silhouette disappear from afar. The prince stood under the tree, trying to find where Cinderella had gone. but her movements were so swift and agile that he could only watch her silhouette disappear from a distance. The prince sighed deeply, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation about meeting her again. As the darkness deepened, only the mysterious moonlight illuminated the prince's face. He hoped to find something under the large tree where she had disappeared. Under the shadow of the tree, the prince muttered, pointing in the direction the strange girl had vanished. "I missed the strange girl. I think she jumped into the pear tree and disappeared." The prince stood numbly under the tree, trying hard to find her trace. The moonlight seeped through the branches and leaves of the tree, and he was confused as he recalled her appearance. A strong desire to meet her again grew in his heart along with his curiosity about her. His anxiety and curiosity continued until her father arrived. The father heard the prince's words and was skeptical. Could it be Cinderella? This question strongly captured him, and he immediately ordered an axe to be brought. They decided to split the tree to see if she was hiding inside. The father and the prince stood around the tree, considering the possibility that she might be inside. The servants began to split the tree with an axe, but even among the deep branches and broad leaves, her trace was not found. They had to accept the reality that they could not find her as they looked at the tree in disappointment. Meanwhile, Cinderella had already returned home. She quietly jumped down from the other side of the tree and returned the splendid clothes to the bird waiting atop the wild pear tree. The bird gently took the clothes with its beak and disappeared somewhere. Cinderella changed back into her old and comfortable ash-gray clothes. These ash-gray clothes were like a protective shield for her, returning her to her ordinary life as a simple girl. Cinderella returned to the kitchen and sat next to the pile of ashes. Her hands and face were covered with ash and dust again, as if her participation in the midnight fantasy-like ball had been a dream, and everything had returned to normal. When the family returned home, Cinderella was sitting in the ashes in the kitchen as usual. Her face and hands were once again covered in soot and dust. It was as if attending the magical ball at midnight had been nothing but a dream, and everything had returned to normal. Cinderella quietly took a deep breath and continued her kitchen chores as if nothing had happened. Her secret was safe, and the prince believed that she was merely a mysterious girl who had appeared and vanished in the night. Her stepsisters and stepmother entered the house, chattering excitedly about the ball. "The prince kept looking at me," boasted the elder sister. "No, he smiled at me," argued the younger sister. Their stepmother listened with a pleased smile, but she paid no attention to Cinderella, who still sat in the ashes, far removed from the splendor of the ball. Cinderella smiled to herself, deep in her heart. No one knew that she had attended the ball, and her secret remained hers alone. She thought back to that night, feeling a warm glow inside her. At dawn, as the gentle sunlight began to wake the village, Cinderella quietly walked to her mother's grave after her parents and stepsisters had left the house. The grave was a place of solace and peace for her. Morning dew glistened on the grass, and small birds chirped to welcome the new day. Cinderella stood before the grave, clasped her hands together, and whispered once again to the magical hazel tree. "Little tree, shake and quiver, let gold and silver fall down over me." Her voice was soft and earnest. As if waiting for her call, the tree began to tremble slightly in response. From the sky, a radiant bird appeared and laid down before her an even more splendid and radiant dress. This dress was more dazzlingly beautiful than any she had received before. It shimmered with a blend of gold and silver, adorned with intricate patterns of silk and silver embroidery, adding to its magnificence. On her feet were shoes made of pure gold that fit her perfectly. These shoes were not merely footwear, but seemed to symbolize her dreams and hopes. Cinderella gazed at the dress with eyes full of wonder. When she entered the ballroom in this magnificent attire, all eyes turned to her. The mere sight of her took everyone's breath away, and the prince searched the room anxiously for her. Her dress sparkled like starlight, making her appear like the moon shining in the night sky. The prince had been eagerly waiting for her arrival, and as soon as she entered, he hurried to take her hand and began to dance with her. His eyes never left hers, and he firmly refused every other request for a dance, saying, "This lady is my partner." Cinderella and the prince danced as if they were the only two people in the world. The music followed their steps joyfully, and their dance looked like a beautiful painting. People watched them breathlessly, unable to take their eyes off the enchanting scene. Cinderella etched that moment deep in her heart, wishing this beautiful night could last forever. The prince's touch was warm and gentle, and his gaze was filled with sincerity. Feeling that this moment was real and not a dream, Cinderella immersed herself even more in the dance with the prince. As the evening grew late, Cinderella decided it was time to leave the ball. She wished this beautiful night wouldn't end, but she knew she had to return to reality. She quickly left the ballroom and ran towards the stairs. However, the prince had anticipated her departure and had spread sticky pitch on the stairs, so when she ran down, her left golden shoe stuck and was left behind. The prince picked up the small, intricate golden shoe, cherishing it as a precious clue. He realized that this shoe was the only way to find the mysterious girl again. The next day, the prince took the shoe and went to Cinderella's father. Confirming Cinderella had returned home, he resolved to find the rightful owner of the shoe. Cinderella's stepmother watched this situation with a suspicious eye, feeling uneasy at the thought that the dazzlingly dressed girl might be under her own roof. She kept a close watch on Cinderella, quietly waiting to see if any secrets would be revealed. In her heart, the stepmother was gripped by the fear that Cinderella might indeed be the mysterious girl. The prince set out with the golden shoe, determined to travel across the country to find its true owner. His resolve was firm, and no one could change his mind. He proclaimed to the entire village, "I will take no bride other than the one who fits this golden shoe." This announcement spread throughout the land, and all the young women eagerly awaited the opportunity. The excitement and anticipation filled every house as they dreamed of becoming the prince's bride by fitting into the beautiful shoe. Especially Cinderella's two stepsisters were overjoyed at the news. They prided themselves on having the most beautiful feet, confident that the shoe would fit perfectly. The older sister and the younger sister each stood in front of the mirror, admiring their feet and saying to each other, "The shoe will definitely fit me." Their stepmother, too, was pleased with their confidence and prepared to enjoy the glory of having one of her daughters become the prince's bride. The older sister went into the room to try on the golden shoe. She wore a beautiful dress and adorned her hair with a fancy ribbon, looking as if she were already the prince's bride. The stepmother watched nervously from beside her. Her gaze conveyed strong expectations and pressure, filling the room with tension. The older sister took a deep breath and slowly tried to put her foot into the shoe. But her big toe was too large. She tried several times to push her foot in, but the shoe still didn't fit. Each attempt brought more disappointment and frustration to her face. The stepmother, faced with this situation, made a ruthless decision. She looked at her daughter with cold eyes and sighed. Quickly scanning the surroundings, she handed her a small knife and mercilessly said, "Cut off your toe. When you become queen, you won't need to walk anymore." The older sister was shocked by her mother's words. But the thought of becoming queen made her determined to endure any pain. The older sister endured extreme pain and cut off her toe. As the small knife touched her toe, a sharp pain engulfed her entire body, and blood gushed out. She gritted her teeth and suppressed the pain as she forced her foot into the shoe. She wrapped her bleeding foot with a thick cloth to hide it and walked towards the prince. She smiled through the pain, but with each step, blood seeped out, and her face grew paler. As she approached the prince, her steps became more and more unsteady. The prince, believing her to be his bride, lifted her onto his horse and slowly made his way to the castle. She sat beside him, struggling to maintain a smile, but her face turned pale, and sweat beaded on her forehead as she tried to endure the pain. With each movement of the horse, her foot hurt more, and the pain etched a deeper expression of suffering onto her face. As they traveled, they passed through a serene forest filled with lush trees and green meadows. Eventually, they approached a small hill where the prince's mother's grave was located. The grave rested beneath a beautiful hazel tree, which seemed to hold many stories and secrets within its old branches. Flowers bloomed around the grave, and the leaves rustled gently in the wind. At that moment, two doves sitting in the hazel tree began to coo at the prince and the older sister. Their cooing seemed clear and distinct, as if they knew the truth of the situation. The doves fluttered their wings and cried out. The doves incessantly cooed and cried out, "Coo, coo, 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 blood is in the shoe is too tight, the true bride is still at home." Their voices echoed like magic. Hearing the doves, the prince felt a deep doubt arise in his heart. He became curious about the truth behind their words and decided to re-examine if the older sister was indeed the rightful owner of the shoe. Listening to the dove's warning, the prince inspected the older sister's foot. Her foot was soaked in red blood inside the shoe, and blood was oozing out. Startled, the prince looked closely at her foot. Blood had filled the shoe's edges and was dripping onto the ground, leaving small crimson spots. The older sister's face was pale, twisted with pain and fear. Tears streamed from her eyes, and her lips trembled. The prince, seeing this, was greatly alarmed. He realized that the older sister was not the true owner of the shoe. It was too small for her foot. The prince lifted her back onto the horse and decided to return her to her home. She cried, feeling she had failed the prince's expectations, but he comforted her gently as they went back. Understanding her pain, he tried to make her as comfortable as possible. She no longer needed to endure the agony of her foot. The prince resolved to find the true owner of the shoe. After returning the older sister home, the prince decided to give the younger sister a chance to try on the golden shoe. Filled with anticipation and excitement, she went into the room. She held the shoe and carefully tried to put her foot into it. Her toes fit into the shoe, but then a problem arose. The shoe was too small at the heel, and it didn't fit. She was flustered and tried desperately to make the shoe fit, but it was in vain. The stepmother observed the situation from the side. She decided to give the younger sister the same terrible advice she had given the older sister. Approaching the younger sister with a ruthless expression, she said, "Cut off a piece of your heel. Once you become queen, you won't need to walk." The stepmother's cold words echoed through the room. The younger sister was shocked by her mother's words. She trembled with fear and pain, but was seized by the thought of not missing the chance to become queen. She steeled herself and took the sharp knife from her mother's hand. The younger sister took a deep breath and looked at her heel. Her mind wavered between fear and resolve, but ultimately, the determination to become queen moved her to act. She bit her lip so hard it nearly bled, and with trembling hands, she lifted the knife. Closing her eyes tightly, she placed the blade against her heel. As the pain surged, she stifled a scream and hot tears welled up in her eyes. The younger sister did as her mother instructed and cut off her heel. Her hands shook as she held the knife, and her eyes were filled with terror. As soon as the blade cut into her heel, she was overwhelmed by excruciating pain, and blood spurted out. She swallowed her tears, wiped away the blood, and forced her foot into the golden shoe. She trembled with unbearable pain until the shoe fit. Enduring the pain, she walked towards the prince. Her face grew pale with pain, and her steps faltered. She tried to smile through the agony, but her eyes betrayed her suffering and fear. The prince, believing the shoe fit, accepted the younger sister as his bride. He lifted her onto his horse and headed towards the castle. The prince seemed relieved to see that the shoe fit, and the younger sister sat carefully beside him. However, her foot was stained with blood, and the pain continued to torment her. As they passed through the tranquil forest and approached the hazel tree, two doves sitting in the branches watched them. The dove sensed something was wrong and began to coo once again. Coo, 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 blood is in the shoe is too tight, the true bride is still at home. The dove's cries echoed like a warning. Hearing them, the prince inspected the younger sister's foot once more. Seeing the blood seeping from the shoe, the prince was alarmed. The shoe was filled with blood, and the younger sister's face was twisted in pain. Realizing she was not the true owner of the shoe, the prince turned his horse around and took her back home. The younger sister wept as she accepted her failure. The blood from her foot stained her white stockings red. The more the blood flowed, the more evident her pain became. She struggled to smile, but her suffering was clearly visible in her eyes and expression. The prince understood that she was not the true owner of the shoe. The prince decided to return the younger sister, whose foot continued to bleed profusely, to her home. As the horse turned, she moaned in pain and leaned against the prince. Her face was pale, and tears filled her eyes. The prince carefully supported her as they headed back. When they arrived home, the prince gently helped her down from the horse. Her foot was still bleeding, and the prince slowly removed the shoe from her foot. As soon as the shoe was off, more blood flowed, and she let out a pained gasp. The prince helped to stop the bleeding and supported her into the house. The prince arrived at Cinderella's family home, determined to find the true bride. He first asked the two stepsisters to try on the golden shoe, but their attempts ended in failure. Both the older and younger sisters made desperate attempts to fit into the shoe, but the results were disastrous. Disappointed, the prince asked Cinderella's father, "Do you have any other daughters?" Her father, with a bewildered expression, replied, "I do have one daughter from my late wife, but she is young and hasn't grown up well, Cinderella. Surely she can't be the prince's bride?" His voice was filled with doubt and confusion, as he found it hard to believe that Cinderella could be the prince's bride. The stepmother also strongly objected. "No, it can't be. That girl is too dirty. How could she possibly appear here?" She completely dismissed the possibility that Cinderella could be the owner of the golden shoe, despising Cinderella's humble and modest appearance. She hoped Cinderella would not disrupt their plans. But the prince was not deterred. With a determined expression, he said to the stepmother and father, "I wish to see Cinderella myself and confirm it. Please bring her here." His voice carried strong resolve, and no one could sway his determination. Cinderella was busy doing chores in the kitchen. Her clothes were dirty with dust and ashes, and her hands and face were smudged with grease and sweat. But upon hearing that the prince wanted to see her, she washed her hands and face clean and left her chores behind. Cinderella tidied her modest attire and appeared before the prince. Though her appearance was humble and simple, her inner beauty still shone brightly. Her eyes were pure, and a warm smile graced her face. The prince was astonished at her appearance. Gently, he offered her the golden shoe and said, "Please, try on this shoe." His voice was warm and gentle. Cinderella sat on a small chair and removed her heavy clogs. Her feet were slightly swollen from long hours of labor, but they were still beautiful. She held the golden shoe in her hands and carefully slipped it onto her foot. The shoe fit her perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. At that moment, Cinderella looked up at the prince. Her eyes were filled with nervousness, anticipation, and a hint of fear. The prince looked at Cinderella's face and remembered the moment from the ball. She was the very girl he had danced with. Her eyes, her smile, everything matched perfectly. The prince's eyes filled with joy and amazement. He was now certain that she was indeed the true bride. Seeing the golden shoe fit Cinderella's foot perfectly, the prince cried out with a voice full of joy, "Ah, this lady is truly my bride." His voice was brimming with happiness and certainty. A bright smile spread across the prince's face, and joyful tears welled up in his eyes. Everyone in the room watched them with astonishment and admiration. In that moment, the prince declared to all that Cinderella was his true bride. The stepmother and stepsisters were stunned and enraged at this sight. The revelation of their schemes and lies left them filled with shock and fear. Their faces turned pale, and their eyes were filled with dread. The prince kept Cinderella by his side and warmly embraced her. The prince lifted Cinderella onto his horse and headed towards the castle. Holding her close, he whispered with a warm smile, "Let us begin our happy future together." Cinderella felt a sense of relief and smiled in his embrace. Together, they rode towards the castle. As they passed by the hazel tree, the two white doves perched on its branches sang once more. Their song was clear and pure, echoing through the air. Coo, 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 there is no blood in the shoe is not too tight, the true bride is with the prince. The two white doves sat on the branches and sang in the quiet forest with a clear and melodious voice. Their voices were like heavenly music. The doves' eyes sparkled, and their feathers glowed in the sunlight. This beautiful song resonated deeply in the hearts of the prince and Cinderella. The doves followed the prince and Cinderella's procession, singing continuously. Their voices carried far on the wind. The trees in the forest swayed gently to the song, and the flowers bloomed even brighter. Their song seemed to bring peace and happiness to all the creatures in the forest. The prince smiled as he listened to the dove's song. He looked at Cinderella and held her hand tightly. Cinderella closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of happiness as she listened to the song. A peaceful smile spread across her face, and tears of joy flowed from her eyes. The song dispelled all doubts and left only the truth. The prince and Cinderella shared a smile of happiness as they listened to the dove's song. The doves' voices resonated clearly and calmly, enveloping their hearts like a melody of blessing. The two doves flew gently and perched on Cinderella's shoulders, one on her right and one on her left. These two doves seemed to symbolize her purity and innocence, resting comfortably on Cinderella's shoulders. Their warm bodies and soft feathers brought her comfort, and their presence felt like a heavenly blessing. The prince, seeing this sight, felt even more assured and held Cinderella's hand tightly as they walked together. Cinderella and the prince's wedding was the most splendid and joyous celebration in the entire kingdom. People from all over the kingdom gathered to celebrate their love and happiness. The cathedral was decorated with beautiful flowers, and the bright sunlight streaming through the stained glass made it even more radiant. In this place filled with hope and joy, everyone smiled brightly as they blessed the bride and groom. Cinderella walked through the cathedral with the prince, dressed in a beautiful wedding gown. Her gown was adorned with delicate lace and sparkling jewels, making her look like a goddess descended from heaven. Holding the prince's hand, she walked forward, leaving behind the painful and difficult past to embrace a new beginning. Her face was full of joy and hope, and tears of happiness welled up in her eyes. However, this day was also a day of reckoning for the stepsisters. While everyone else celebrated Cinderella and the prince's love with joy, the stepsisters were shunned from the festivities. Their wicked actions and selfish past had been exposed to everyone. They were scorned for their past cruelty and oppression towards Cinderella. As the bride and groom walked towards the church, the stepsisters still followed them. The older sister walked on the bride's right side, and the younger sister on the left. They still longed for forgiveness, but their sins were too great to be easily pardoned. At that moment, two doves flew down from the hazel tree above the grave and began to circle around them. The doves flew through the air, circling several times before suddenly pecking out one eye from each stepsister. Their screams of pain echoed, a divine punishment for their lies and wickedness. Their agonized cries filled the air, and the doves seemed to have come down to right their wrongs. The doves fulfilled the role of restoring heavenly order, bringing justice to the stepsisters. After the wedding, the bride and groom walked out of the church into the bright sunlight. At that moment, the doves reappeared in the sky. They swooped down like heavenly judges and circled above the heads of the older and younger sisters. The sound of the doves' wings flapping echoed in the ears of everyone in front of the church, drawing all eyes to them. Suddenly, the doves dove towards the sisters and pecked out their remaining eyes. The sisters screamed in agony, their faces contorted with fear and pain. Their cries echoed in the churchyard, and the onlookers were struck with awe at the sight. The stepsisters were condemned to live in blindness for the rest of their lives, as a punishment for their wickedness and deceit. They could no longer torment or deceive others, and their dark past would be remembered forever. Their lives were now confined to eternal darkness as a consequence of their evil actions. People witnessing this scene realized that evil deeds eventually lead to their rightful consequences. Cinderella and the prince observed this, witnessing the doves administering justice. The doves circled above Cinderella and the prince once more, singing a song of blessing. Holding hands, Cinderella and the prince walked towards a bright future. They had found true happiness, and their love would endure forever. The doves, blessing Cinderella and the prince's new beginning, soared high into the sky. Their song carried a message of hope and love to everyone. With bright smiles, Cinderella and the prince began their new life together.